At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sally Godard. While researching for a presentation in Philadelphia last month, Dr. Godard learned that several of her immigrant farmer ancestors had enslaved Africans in the colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. We Americans are awakening to the broad extent of chattel slavery and its industry in the North, not just in the South. As we deconstruct this illusion of freedom, we can see its scars. How are we called to respond? Sally is a lifelong Oregonian moving to Yamhill County in 1988, where her 3 children grew up, graduating from OHSU's School of Medicine. She recently retired from a long career of psychiatry. She has been an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ for 12 years with a focus on justice ministries. She is married to Ron Olazar, and they enjoy their country life with goats, a fruit orchard, and grandchildren. Sally and Ron continue their community volunteer work in Holly Springs, Mississippi.
Next time I'll write a shorter biography. Moses was out herding sheep. He had left Egypt. He had escaped from Egypt after killing a man, going into the wilderness, where he met a man who took him in, and then he married this man's daughter. So he was out herding the sheep for his father-in-law. Suddenly he turns and he sees a bush that's in flame, and yet it has not been burned down. It has not been consumed. He turned closer to look at it. "Moses, Moses," God called out of the bush. Moses said, "Here am I." "Moses, you must take off your sandals because you are standing on holy ground." About 5 weeks ago, just this last week, I returned after a 5.5-week absence. I got off the plane late, went into the house, fell asleep. The next day I got out to walk around to see what home looked like after 5 weeks away. I was startled by this bush. It was aflame. I walked up close to it to look at it. I knew it was holy ground. I wanted to take off my shoes like you might do when you enter a house. I was home. We're on holy ground today. We're home. We're in our neighborhood with the squirrels. We belong. So it was a month ago when I sent in the information to Pat, wherever Pat is. There's Pat, yes, about what I was going to talk about today. And now a month ago seems a really long time ago, doesn't it? The title of my talk hasn't changed, but I have to admit that I come with a changed context that we're all dealing with. And within this changed context, I also feel a new sense of urgency. In early October, I gave a talk in Philadelphia that was at a conference, the Slave Dwelling Project. Mr. McGill is the director, and he puts on a conference every year. The theme of it this year was the illusion of freedom, slavery in the northern states. I decided to submit a proposal. The presentation has taken nearly 60 years. It's coming together, but it's not finished yet. But I was well into middle age before I could even imagine writing such a title as this. My knowledge of slavery began here in my school years here in Oregon. What did I learn about slavery at school? Really quite a lot. We knew about slavery. And I was an avid reader. I loved reading those little blue book biographies that I found in a library. And I would sit home with the 1960 World Book Encyclopedia and read history. I was a history nut then, even then. But my brain also incorporated many inaccuracies that I read and heard. These inaccuracies allowed me to build a personal identity, a family identity, a strong identity as a person from a free state whose ancestors were northerners, pretty much dirt farmers. They kept moving west as they looked for better land. My ancestors were the younger sons who received little inheritance and finally made it to Oregon. I had ancestors who fought for the Union from Indiana and Illinois and Ohio and Pennsylvania. And I had Quaker ancestors whose homes in Ohio served as a station on the Underground Railroad. Now, if we don't mention the indigenous peoples that we trampled over as we headed west, I descended from the good guys, didn't I? Yeah, that's what I thought. I'm a northerner. I talked to my little grandchildren about the Civil War, and well, we were on the right side, right? Yes, but then perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, I had an aunt and a cousin who were very into genealogy at that time, and they discovered this painting. This painting was done in about 1848 by a fourth cousin of mine, 4 times removed or something as well. And he was painting a picture of his grandfather's farm, a rather idyllic piece of art from his imagination as a boy in New Utrecht, New York. What do you see in this photo? There's a black worker, isn't there? There are 2 black workers, one back with the hay, maybe 3. Years later, after the Civil War, he almost duplicated exactly the same picture, and those people were now white. But in 1848, he painted this one. That's when the first scale fell from my eyes. Did my ancestor really have slaves? Perhaps some of you were taught or grew up with some of these myths. Count them off on your fingers as I read them. They only had slaves in the South. Slaves were treated better in the North. Slaves were just owned by rich people. Quakers didn't own slaves. Northerners were all abolitionists. Slavery ended in the North in 1776 when the colonies declared independence from the British. White men joined the Union Army to free the slaves. Any of those sound familiar to you? Believe it or not, at this conference that was filled with mostly people from the Northeast, they too had grown up with these myths. Even in the schools in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, they didn't learn that there were slaves in those states. This got me wondering, what about my other ancestors? I began researching. And in the last 5 to 10 years, particularly after the pandemic, when organizations didn't have much to do because everything was closed down, so they went and digitized a bunch of stuff, it's a lot easier to find out answers to these questions on the internet than it used to be. I also realized that researching all my ancestors would take decades. And so Rutger Houston van Brunt was my 8th great-grandfather. Do you know how many 8th great-grandparents you have? 1,024. I wasn't going to get to all of those. So I began with my great-grandparents because those are the ones that I heard about. From my parents, I heard bits and pieces about their grandparents. Not much, because they were both the youngest in their families, and so their grandparents weren't alive that long after they were born. But I did hear about 8 of my great-grandparents. 6 out of 8 of these emigrated to ports in Philadelphia, New York, or Connecticut. 2 arrived in ports of the Chesapeake Bay, the mid-Atlantic. The yellow stars indicate lineages for whom I now have evidence of being enslavers in colonial time and beyond. I suspect at least one other, maybe more, in this lineage here were enslavers, but I haven't found the primary evidence yet. I don't know that I need to. I think I know the answer to these questions I have. Now, the fellow down there with his two red stars down there, he was actually from Edinburgh, and when he was about 12 to 15, he was kidnapped by American pirates, because or British pirates actually, because the tobacco growers needed more indentured servants. So that's how he got here. Just to show you, the little girl in the left-hand picture, the little girl sitting in the middle, that's my grandma Lena. I never met my grandma because she died when my father was in Europe during World War II. But it's her parents that I had heard about and were looking back into their lineage. And so Laura Evelyn Van Brunt and Wilson Sumner Holcomb. Most of my ancestors are English and Scottish, but I always like to bring in the one Dutch ancestor. Now, Laura grew up with 6 brothers, the daughter of a Dutch wheat farmer in eastern Washington. Wilson was a Methodist preacher and was raised and educated in Ohio with 6 siblings. His father fought in the Civil War when he was just 7 years old, and his mother participated with the Underground Railroad in Ohio. But let's go back a little bit. Let's go back with the Van Brunts first. because this is a history I didn't know really well. We'd hear bits and pieces in our education. Henry Hudson, he discovered what? The Hudson River, and there was a sign, Hudson River. No, it actually had a very wonderful name that was Lenape, indigenous name, and I can't remember how to pronounce it, but it meant water that goes both ways. So the Hudson River was named in the indigenous times as the river that meets the sea and the water is going both ways. I just love that. He had tried to find the Northwest Passage for the English 2 times. No luck. He went to the Dutch companies. They probably gave him a better ship, a little more money, a better crew, and he tried again. That time he had success. He found the river, and that changed life for the Lenape people and also the Dutch. He traveled up that river that goes 2 ways. It didn't take long for the Dutch to take advantage of this. By 1621, they had founded the Dutch West India Company. You remember they had the East Indian Company already. They founded the West one. They settled on Mannahatta. Can you recognize that word? Mannahatta. They settled there, eventually purchased the island, and created this settlement. And in 1627, there were 22 enslaved Africans that landed. Didn't take long, did it? So, Mr. Rutger probably came from a tiny village up in northern Holland. Why he went to the New World, we don't know. He was probably a peasant farmer there. Don't know much about him. He didn't even have a last name. He went by Rutger Houston, Rutger son of Just. He was born about 1630. When he arrived in Mannahatta in 1653, it was called New Amsterdam. Look how lovely it would have been at that time. Little trees and Dutch houses all over and nice little streets. And where's Wall Street? Because Wall Street is where the palisades to protect the fort were built, and they were built by Africans. In fact, Wall Street became the boundary line to where Africans could live. They had to live above Wall Street in the woods, rather than where the rest of the Dutch community was. Fort Amsterdam was down at the very bottom. They also developed within a couple of decades a slave market place to sell slaves down at the southern end as well. When an investor decided to buy some land across the water in what is now Brooklyn, they had settled little villages around the area. The last one to be settled was this area down in Utrecht, down at the bottom. And that area was bought by this investor for, you see there? 6 shirts, 2 pairs of shoes, 6 pairs of stockings, 2 adzes. Do you know what an adze is? It's that tool down there. I think that's the most valuable thing in there, actually. 6 knives, 2 scissors, and 6 combs. And 18 families were given permission to buy land there. One of them was my ancestor. He lived in a house that eventually was this one that was destroyed sometime in the early 1900s. When he lived there, it was probably just that one-room house. He and his wife lived there. They actually have a copy of the land grant that Governor Peter Stuyvesant, remember Governor Peter Stuyvesant with the peg leg? That's all I hardly remember about him. That's the land grant that he was given. Free land. Did any Africans get free land? No. So 3 years later, after they settled there, Governor Peter comes over and says, you guys need to get your act together. You've got to erect houses, keep a manservant there to protect you all, and also enclose your village with a good, strong palisade. Well, probably at least half of these households were young men who really had come over to get rich in the fur trade and then go home. So it was really hard to pull them together to do what they were supposed to do. And so within a few months, the agent who was supposed to get all these people to do what Governor Peters wanted them to do, wrote back to the governor, to the noble, very worshipful, honorable Director General. That's quite a title. Some of these people around here are evil-minded people in the midst of us. Some are absent who won't follow our advice. They always oppose the well-disposed, flocking together riotously, even refuse to obey the agent. That was him. Therefore, we humbly request that your honors will please send over as promised some Negroes. Okay? So that's how the first Negroes got to the area of Brooklyn, to New Utrecht. The interesting thing that's a little different here is they were enslaved by the West India Company. And so for quite a few years, the West India Company had bought them and then would hire them out to the farmers in New Utrecht. So this tells us it was this group of enslaved men that built New Utrecht. My ancestor did well. He helped start the Dutch Reformed Church that is still standing there. He was in important positions. He had a bit of land. And here's a way you can tell how he did over the years. This was written by a family historian from the 1800s who had looked up some of the tax records. 57, he moves to New Utrecht. By 93, he has 2 enslaved people. My guess is the reason he doesn't have them before then is because they were still owned by the Dutch West Indies. By 98, he has 5 enslaved people. 5 was a high number for that area because all these people were farmers, and so they tended to have 2 to 3 people with their farming occupation, not like the southern plantations where you had hundreds. What's a morgan of land? 72 morgans of land. Any of you know? I always get into these details. These are the rabbit holes that take me so long. A morgan is 60 to 70% of a togberg. Right? You know what a togberg is? Yes, you know you're German or Dutch, yes. A togberg is a day's work. And it was figured out by how much a man could get done, a single man with a single blade plow with 1 horse or 1 oxen. That was a togberg. And a morgan was how much you could get done in the morning. And of course, you got more done in the morning, 60 to 70%, than you would have in the afternoon when you're starting to get tired, right? So that's a bit of trivia you can quiz somebody on. So looking forward, Rutger had 3 sons. He had daughters too, but they didn't talk about daughters back then. And the one in green, Nicholas, is the one that is my ancestor. All of these people owned slaves. They were all enslavers. Even Nicholas, by the time he went to New Jersey, we'll say more about that, probably had enslaved people with him. And I want to show you how these show up. Here's another one for taxes. They were taxed on chimneys, which back then they called chimblies, and Negroes for tax purposes. And so there's, this is my descendant, Cornelius, his father, Ludger, the one above him, and down below is his brother. And you can see the number of chimneys that they had. Their house was getting bigger, you can tell. This one shows up in a will. You see the itemized, along with six old corn bags, which are listed here. At the beginning, we have a Negro named Will, a Negro wench called Mary, a Negro boy called Matt. I really like seeing these names because one of the things that a lot of people are doing now is trying to identify people, trying to put names to people. And this kind of information helps a whole lot as African American people are trying to find their ancestors. It also gives us a chance to say their names out loud, to personalize and humanize the people that were enslaved. Many of my ancestors live here. It's kind of crumbled down, but a beautiful old graveyard in Brooklyn. But my direct ancestor moved into New Jersey. But look at this. In 1703, this was before he moved to New Jersey, more than 42% of New York City's households held slaves. That was higher than in Boston or Philadelphia, and it was second only to Charleston in the South. Did you ever hear that as a kid? I never heard that as a kid. In Kings County, that's Brooklyn, the agricultural, they were really the breadbasket for Manhattan. And in Kings County, the farmers became even more and more reliant on this free labor. By 1790, 61% of the households were enslavers. 33, a third of the population were enslaved people. Okay. I know I'm looking at time and going nuts. Okay. All right. I will say just a little bit about this, but I think this is a new idea we have that I've learned. It's not a new idea. I learned this more recently. Is these East Coast states, Northeast Coast states, did what they called gradual abolition of slavery. So in 1799, they made the decision that everyone born before July 4th, 1799 would stay a slave for the rest of their life. If you were born after July 4th, 1799, you would be free, but you must serve the enslaver of the mother until you are either 25 or 28. Hardly sounds free, does it? But when you look at the records, when did New York free their slaves? You will read 1799, not 21 or 25 years later. Okay. And slavery persisted long after those dates, because in many places nobody came to tell them you're free. All right. I want to make a quick mention, and we won't go through these, but John Holcomb and Sarah Scott are the Quaker part of our ancestry. English, early Quakers from the very beginning. John was jailed in a terrible prison in southwest England and was caught all sorts of diseases, died early, I suspect, of tuberculosis. They landed, Sarah went on to take her sons and the new man she had married and went to Philadelphia in hopes of a new life and lived in a Quaker community. Sarah's son John bought property just up the river on the Delaware River. This house actually is the one they lived in, but when they lived in it, it was just this little part. So a small house. Another ancestor, his son, John's son, Samuel, built this storage house, and Ron and I just went to see both of these for the first time. So we've got the Holcombs, Samuel Holcomb up there, and what we wanted to find out whether any of these were enslavers. I found out that the ones with yellow dots there were all enslavers. This arrow here, if you look on some of the genealogy records back east, it just says went west. Sort of like, he's out of the family now, went west. But that was my ancestors there who then moved to Ohio. Quakers were slave owners until 1776. They could own slaves. So for the first 125 years of their existence, they were slave owners. We can find information here from tax lists, and New Jersey also had a gradual abolition of slaves. We found out some of the information here because when a child was born from a slave mother, they had to record the date so they would know when that 25 years was up. And here we find that two of the Holcomb family, there were babies born in 1805, and the mothers show up there. They also show up in wills. And in this will, he's asking that my Negro, Dinah, be sold and then manumitted and set free after 3 years. New Jersey didn't pass a act to abolish slavery until 1846. They had 16 enslaved people in 1866. We're still enslaved. So we know about Juneteenth nowadays. New Jersey still had enslaved people after Juneteenth. So these are some of the things I've learned in this process. Slavery was in the North and the South. Our economy was built on free labor after the Revolutionary War. We were completely poor then. How did we get back so fast? It was the enslaved labor. It was different in the North, but it was still slavery and still lots of brutality. And the religion didn't keep very many people from having slaves. Economic benefits outweighed any ethical or moral concerns. We know that there are many legacies of slavery. Oregon has its own history of being anti-Black people. They refused to pass the 15th Amendment that gives Black men a right to vote, and only passed it in 1959. That's whole Oregon history is a whole nother talk that's worth having and worth knowing if you're gonna live here for a little while. What now? What do we do? What do we do as individuals with this information? What do we do as families? What do we do as communities and nation? That's what I want us to grapple with. I think all of us in communities like this need to grapple with this and say, what is our piece to play in that? And I'm going to end back with Moses again. Moses heard God in the burning bush. He says, "Here I am." And then God starts to talk to him. He says, "You need to go back to Egypt. You need to get your brethren there. You need to get the Hebrews and free them." And Moses kept putting up barriers, I can't do that. They're going to kill me. Why do they won't know that you're speaking to me and telling me to do this. How can I prove that? I can't speak. I don't speak very well. He had all sorts of excuses. But God from the burning bush said, "You must go." And eventually, Moses did, so the story goes. We stand on our holy ground. We stand in front of our burning bush. We say, here am I, I'm home. But how are we called to take the next step after that and go out into the world again to show compassion and do justice? That's our question today. Thank you.